To start with my short introduction, I will not say too much on this opening speech, but the title and the subtitle, I think, already illustrates more or less the message which we would like to put through the new urban world, sunny side up. And the message essentially that cities, of course, can often be seen as sources of issues, problems, concerns, but that in our view the only proper response is to see cities as sources of many new opportunities which might save the world up to the year 2050. Just very few observations. I will not go into more detail because there is a whole series of recent publications around many of these issues. We live increasingly in an urban world, and especially in the developed world we see still an ongoing rise in urbanization, but gradually also the developing world is following Latin America, Asia and also Africa, so that holds in fact all over the world. That does not necessarily mean that each individual city would increase its size in terms of population, for instance, because if there are more people in cities, other cities might lose. There is an urban shrinkage in some countries as well, but overall the net balance is still a very positive balance, reinforcing urbanization. We have heard this morning many presentations on issues in Morocco, on how to provide housing for people, how to provide infrastructure, very important issues. At the same time, cities will not survive if they are not powerhouses for economic growth. And with all the transitions in different countries, with different growth trajectories, it is quite clear that in many countries the urban-rural divide is gradually vanishing. My own country, until 5 years back, also had always a discussion on urban and rural. Gradually have come to the conclusion that the distinction between urban and rural has completely been lost in our country, which of course is a smaller country, but this is a trend we also observe in Switzerland, Germany and other countries all over the world. Now the new urban world, just historically starting from individual settlements towards cities, metropolitan areas, increasingly polycentric agglomerations, and that's what we observe in many countries nowadays. I mentioned already the eastern side of the US, the same holds for the Ruhr area, northern Italy, and Randstad in the Netherlands, and the major London, Ile-de-France in Paris, and so on, toward global urban networks. And this is a very recent phenomenon. If you look into two examples, Athens on the one hand and Tokyo, in fact 150 years ago, small villages, and nowadays huge metropolitan areas. So there has been in the past century, 1.5 century, an enormous transition all over the world in terms of people moving to cities, and especially with demographic growth, more people will reside in cities because that's the only place where you have the best opportunities. That's already extensively documented in the literature, both the economics, you have the economics literature on externalities, etc., but also in the well-known Todaro studies on developing countries. Poor people will move into the cities, because even when temporarily you become even more poor in the city, in the longer run it pays off. So if you make a calculation of your estimated income over 1 or 2 generations, even for the poorest person, it's better to move into the city. Even in the first 10 years you are still more poor than ever before. In the longer run it pays off. So these are some of the issues involved, are some of the circular causality mechanisms which I just quickly leave aside. Moving to the question, what are the main challenges? Urban sustainability for the future. We have seen fantastic examples also during our field trip in Morocco. all the issues of social equity, including slums, ecological quality, including green cities, of course also cities as engines of economic growth had to be combined. What I now would like to do in the remaining 5 or 6 minutes or so, and just put forward a few statements. And I would like just to elaborate a little bit on these statements. Statement 1, I have 5 statements. Statement 1, cities are powerful economic vehicles to ensure continued economic growth, especially in the period of economic recession. To make a challenging and a daring statement, the best way to cope with economic decline and recessions is to favor and reinforce urbanization, because cities are the most efficient way to organize our forces. That also has been recognized by the Chinese leadership. The more you organize your force in cities, the more competitive you become. So there are, as I mentioned before, all kinds of theoretical frameworks on why cities do exist, the genesis of cities, also the growth of cities. I'm not going into more detail at this moment. And I would just like to draw your attention to something which in recent years has become rather pronounced as a hypothesis for the time being, so-called Santa Fe hypothesis, which reflects a series of studies done by Jeffrey West and his colleagues at the Santa Fe Institute, where based on a huge database of cities all over the world, they come to the conclusion that each doubling of city size prompts an efficiency rise of 15%, not only from an economic perspective, also from an ecological, environmental and energy use perspective. If you ever want to be competitive as a nation, go for bigger cities. That's more or less the message of Lord Jeffrey West. It can be questioned because it just put it here as a hypothesis, but it seems to have quite some validity. Demographic growth, especially in the Latin American, African, Asian parts of our world, it does not affect the economic growth potential of cities, but offers a great opportunity for the future. That has to do also with, that you also find it in studies of Wolfgang Lutz, one of the well-known demographers in Europe, where he has been extensively studying natural growth rates, including migration and all that shit, and comes to the conclusion that demography as such is not the major issue, but it depends more on organization of society and so on. Immigration, we also have heard quite some elements in Morocco, because you have rural-urban migration, and of course you have also migration from other African countries, both from the North African rim and from the southern parts. That leads to the need for what they've called in a recent study MIA, Migration Impact Assessment at any spatial level. Statement number 3, I just will go quickly. Land use control is of course very important, and it was interesting what we found in Morocco, that in planning new towns, that first the infrastructure is put in place, the roads, the electricity systems, the sewage systems, and then houses are built. That's rather unique in this part of the world, because in many cases, if you go further down Africa, you get all these bidonvilles, all these slums, they start somewhere uncontrolled, then later on to put in infrastructure. Once everything has been built, it's very expensive and very inefficient. So there are a series of questions to be addressed here as well. I mentioned already cities as economic powerhouses and powerhouses of creativity, and that I think will be important for the future. So having said this, I will go immediately to statement 5, i.e. socioeconomic inequality. It's a logical consequence. It's not always the problem which is has to bother so extensively. There are containers of poverty, but they are also sustainability issues. Research challenges, finally the last 30 seconds. Cities, sources and competitors vis-à-vis protectionism. Islands of low positioning, these are the new views on the cities. Territorial administration mentioned in the previous speech vis-à-vis network governance. and of course various analytical new tools which would have to be addressed. And having said this, this is the final message. So,